Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a time when the world feels like it's ending. The year is 1347, and a silent killer is creeping into Europe, not with fanfare, not with a shout, but with the soft scuttle of rats, the flea's bite, and the rising heat of a fever no one escapes. You're in the heart of a crowded medieval city, where chamber pots empty into the street and bread costs more than a week's pay. People talk of omens, of stars aligning, of God's wrath. And outside the city gates, death waits, patient and invisible. And you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I put a lot into these. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear it before you see it, a low moan, not quite human. It comes from the ship bobbing at the dock. Sailors lie on the deck, unmoving, their skin blotched purple and black like spilled ink. The cargo smells of spice and spoiled meat. You hold your breath. It won't help. The Black Death has arrived in Europe. Over the next few months, bodies pile up like firewood. They're loaded onto carts, some still groaning, and wheeled to mass graves just outside town. Dirt doesn't even cover the smell. Every street corner becomes a sermon, every stranger a suspect. You're told to pray harder, whip yourself, bury the cat. Yes, for real. People actually blamed cats for spreading the plague and started killing them. Irony alert, that just let the rat population explode. But fear doesn't just sit there like an unwanted dinner guest. It starts whispering. At first, it's just chatter in the market. That woman over there hasn't gotten sick. Maybe she's a witch. That family has clean water. Maybe they know something. Then someone points at the town's Jewish quarter. You glance up, mid-soup slurp. Someone says they're not getting sick. Someone else says they never buy bread from the baker anymore. And then, chillingly, a rumor grows legs. The Jews are poisoning the wells. Now, you know that's nonsense. But your neighbor's friend's cousin heard it from a merchant in Barcelona, and he heard it from a guy who swore on his goat's grave. You can't disprove it. And when you're surrounded by death and rot and nobody has answers, not the church, not the doctors with their bird beak masks, you'll believe anything. This lie didn't appear in a vacuum. Anti-Semitism wasn't new. Jews in medieval Europe were already living under constant suspicion, barred from many trades, forced into money lending, segregated into separate quarters. It was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. And now, the plague, that dark fog creeping into lungs and lymph nodes, gave terrified people a reason to light the match. Historians still argue whether the first whisper came from a local official looking to deflect blame or from panicked citizens desperate for control. Either way, that one lie, that Jews were poisoning wells, spread faster than the fleas. As early as January 1348, in the Swiss town of Chillon, a group of Jewish men were tortured into confessing that they'd dumped poison into wells. Never mind that the plague struck places where no Jews lived. Never mind that it spread along trade routes, not water systems. A tortured man will tell you he turned into a duck if you twist the screws long enough. Meanwhile, the church waffled. Pope Clement VI issued official statements saying Jews were not to blame, even offering them refuge in some cities. But in the chaos, papal decrees were paper shields against real fire. Back in the street, you feel it. The way people stop talking when a Jew walks by. The way guards suddenly appear near the well. You're not even Jewish, but you feel the static in the air, a tension, sharp and sour. The lie has legs now, and it's sprinting. One town falls, then another. Strasbourg, Basel, Mainz. In each mob's form, someone's always ready to lead, someone who says they'll cleanse the town. And they don't mean by mopping. You keep your head down, you lock your door, but the lie is louder than reason now. It's amazing how fast terror turns into rage. Word spreads that confessions have been obtained. Confessions under torture, of course. But hey, who needs details when you're scared out of your mind and everyone's dying? Soon, entire communities are accused of plotting. Jewish homes are searched, books burned, people dragged from their beds at midnight. In Basel, nearly 600 Jews are rounded up, locked inside a wooden house and burned alive. The town authorities even banned Jews from living there for the next 200 years, as if absence could absolve their guilt. You want to believe someone will step in, that cooler heads will prevail. But this is the Middle Ages, and Twitter doesn't exist yet. Lies back then weren't just viral, they were lethal. Here's a quirky footnote. Some cities actually protected their Jewish populations, not out of kindness, but because they owed them money. Burning your creditors isn't good for the economy, so yeah, financial pragmatism saved lives where compassion didn't. History's full of weird trade-offs like that. But in most places, the lie wins. It whispers its poison in every language: Latin, German, French, from mountain villages to bustling port towns. And each time someone listens, someone dies. The truth? The plague was spread by fleas on rats, not bucket poisoners or cabals. But people couldn't see that. The science wasn't there yet. So they went with what made emotional sense, what offered a villain, and once a lie becomes convenient, it becomes nearly unstoppable. You're tired. You haven't slept well in days. The bells keep ringing. Another death, another cart, another rumor. And somewhere deep inside, you wonder, what if the poison was real? You know it's wrong, but the fear is louder than your thoughts. And fear is always hungry. You wake to shouting, again. You're getting used to it now. Another accusation, another arrest. Outside your window, a group of men marches past with torches. No one speaks, no one dares to. The lie has officially caught fire. That whisper about poisoned wells? It's now doctrine in the minds of thousands. You see it etched in angry graffiti, carved onto the sides of churches, muttered under breath at taverns. They did this, people say. They brought death. The lie, elegant in its cruelty, provides something terrifyingly addictive, a sense of control. Because if someone caused the plague, then maybe it can be stopped. In Barcelona, things go from eerie to explosive. The Jewish quarter, once a bustling hub of scholars, traders, and families, is stormed by a mob. Homes are looted, scrolls burned, children dragged into the street. In the span of a day, a whole community is unraveled like a dropped spool of thread. And nobody steps in, not the mayor, not the bishops, just silence, the kind that makes your teeth ache. Meanwhile, you hear about places even worse. In Zurich, Jews are forced to dig their own mass grave before being executed. In Brussels, they're blamed not just for the plague, but for storms and failed crops, like some sort of apocalyptic bingo card. It's not logic, it's momentum. Once violence begins, it doesn't stop politely. Historians still argue whether these coordinated attacks were spontaneous uprisings or sanctioned purges. In many cases, both might be true. A local lord whispers encouragement, a priest nods from the pulpit, a wink here, a bribe there, and suddenly, everything burns. Let's talk about Strasbourg, February 1349. It's a cold morning, and the frost clings to everything like a last defense. The city council has convened, and someone presents evidence, again obtained under torture, that the Jews of the city have plotted to poison every Christian well from here to Paris. This isn't just paranoid fear, it's policy now. And with terrifying efficiency, the council acts. About 2,000 Jews are rounded up. Half are offered conversion. The rest, herded into a massive wooden structure built in the center of the city. You watch, silent as it's set alight. The fire burns for hours. The air fills with the stink of charred cloth and something worse. You try to look away, but the lie won't let you. It forces you to witness. Even stranger, after the massacre, Strasbourg's officials draft a new ordinance. No Jews are allowed in the city for 100 years. It sounds like the world's most horrific no-return policy. One chronicler at the time, whose name you don't remember, but whose words you can't forget, writes that the city felt cleansed. That's how deep the lie ran. Not just believed, but celebrated. And yet, the plague keeps killing. No matter how many people are burned or banished, the death toll climbs. It doesn't pause to acknowledge your efforts. The rats don't care. The fleas certainly don't. They thrive in the aftermath. Empty houses make great nesting grounds. It's around now that something inside you starts to shift, a quiet, gnawing dread. Not at the disease, that's familiar by now, but at the choices people are making. You thought your neighbors were decent, that they'd never cheer a massacre, but they did, and you were there. You were quiet? It's not just towns either. Entire regions follow suit. In Mainz, over 6,000 Jews are murdered in a frenzy that lasts just 2 days. In Erfurt, nearly the entire Jewish population is wiped out. And in Cologne, rather than face the mobs, many Jews choose to set fire to their own homes, trading a swift end for the unthinkable alternative. Here's a fringe tidbit. In some areas, the few surviving Jewish communities bury their dead facing west, not east, breaking tradition. Historians think it might have been a subtle act of protest, or maybe just despair. No one knows for sure. And speaking of uncertainty, remember those papal decrees we mentioned earlier? Well, Pope Clement VI does try. He declares that Jews couldn't be to blame. He even grants them sanctuary in Avignon. But elsewhere, his words have the impact of a damp feather. In many towns, clergy outright ignore him. Some even lead the charge. In your own village, the priest starts hinting that his sermons are just suggestions, and that righteous anger is part of God's will. It's barely veiled, and the people in the pews, they nod. Meanwhile, the torture grows more organized. Across Europe, local officials draw up standard procedures: thumbscrews, iron boots, the rack. The goal? Confessions that fit the story. Don't worry if the timeline makes no sense, or if the accused couldn't possibly have traveled between cities that fast. Logic is optional, fear is mandatory. One man in Narbonne is accused of poisoning wells 300 miles away on the same day he was proven to be at home. You mention this to someone, they shrug. The devil can fly. You stop arguing. There's this idea among some modern scholars that the well poisoning myth didn't survive simply because people were fooled, but because people wanted to believe it, because it gave them an enemy they could see, a scapegoat with a name and a face. And it's much easier to light a match than to admit you're powerless. Funny thing, people start noticing that some Jewish communities did have lower death rates, not because of evil potions or secret rituals, but because of religious cleanliness laws. Washing hands before meals, ritual baths, clean water storage. The very things that made Jews targets also might have saved some of them. But try explaining that to a town mid-frenzy. You'll be lucky to escape with your teeth. You hear rumors now of survivors fleeing to Poland, where King Casimir III offers protection. For a time, it becomes a refuge, a place where truth, or at least peace, is still possible. But you know deep down, the lie isn't gone. It's just sleeping. And even as the bodies continue to fall and the streets grow quiet, the suspicion doesn't lift. It settles like dust, in your lungs, your clothes, your dreams. The Black Death may be a disease of the body, but the lie? That's a disease of the soul. You don't notice the turning point right away. At first, it's just a strange silence. The bells aren't ringing as often. The gravediggers move slower now, not because there are more bodies, but because there are fewer. The plague has started to recede in some towns, curling back like a tide that never asked permission to crash ashore. But the damage has already been done. The lie, remember, that one whispered claim about poisoned wells, has carved deep scars across Europe. And now that the worst of the disease has passed, people start pretending nothing happened. They sweep the ashes, clean the bloodstains from the square, and go back to baking bread and shouting about taxes. Like thousands of innocent people weren't just murdered in broad daylight. You still remember the fire, the faces, the silence of those who watched. And what's worse, nobody talks about it. Not really. The blame stays pinned like a rusty medal on the victims, and the towns that lit the match never apologize. They don't even blink. History has a habit of doing that, glancing away when it's most uncomfortable. But let's back up just a bit. We haven't talked about the confessions. If the first section was about fear and the second about fury, this one is about fiction. Very dark, very official fiction, because now the lie needs to justify itself. And so, across Europe, you find towns keeping records, scrolls and ledgers scribbled with the tortured words of people who confessed under unimaginable pain. Men who admitted to meeting in secret Jewish councils, planning to extinguish all Christians. Women accused of smuggling powder into wells with the help of Satan. Yes, Satan gets a co-starring role now. Because when a lie is this big, it needs some supernatural flair. One document claims that a rabbi named Jacob led a continent-wide conspiracy, distributing poison wrapped in wax and hidden inside eggshells. Sounds absurd, right? But to desperate officials, it makes perfect sense. These records are copied, shared between cities like grim trading cards. Look, they say, they admitted it there too. Of course, historians today know these documents are fantasy, pain-drenched hallucinations constructed under threat of death. But at the time, people believe them, they quote them, they kill because of them. And here's a chilling little aside. Some of those forged confessions survive today, sitting quietly in archives and museums, words written by trembling hands, forced to invent sins they never committed. You wonder if the ink stained their fingers, if they knew no one would believe the truth. Meanwhile, the executions keep coming. By 1350, it's estimated that over 200 Jewish communities across Europe have been destroyed. Some towns lose every last member, entire family lines erased. You walk through one of those places now, empty, quiet. The synagogue burned down, the cemetery looted, a child's toy lying in the dirt, untouched for months. You wonder what it was like here before the fear, before the lie. In some places, the torturers get creative. They invent new punishments. Jews are accused not just of poisoning wells, but of making pacts with demons, of conspiring to kill the king, of blaspheming sacred relics. You see the same pattern over and over again. Accusation, torture, confession, execution. Repeat. It becomes a ritual, grotesque and predictable. Historians still argue whether this moment marks the beginning of a deeper shift in European anti-Semitism, a transition from religious resentment to something more systemic, more racialized. Before the plague, Jewish communities were persecuted, yes, but tolerated in many places. After, they're often banned completely, erased not just physically, but culturally. And here's the dark joke of it all. The very people killed for spreading the plague are gone now, but the plague, still lurking, still alive in fleas and rats and the filthy corners of Europe. The lie didn't solve anything. It just redirected the fire away from the truth. You overhear a traveler from England mention that over there, things weren't quite as horrific. Not because they were more tolerant, but because, brace yourself, the Jewish population had already been expelled decades earlier. So, there was no one left to blame. The lie needs a target after all. But don't worry, people got creative. In the absence of Jews, others were accused. Lepers, foreigners, even beggars. Anyone who looked different, acted strange, or simply stood in the wrong spot at the wrong time. That's how lies work. When they outlive their first victims, they simply find new ones. Let's not forget the economic side either. Remember how some cities only protected Jews because they owed them money? Well, guess what happened in towns where they didn't? Wealthy citizens and local governments seized Jewish property after the massacres. Businesses, homes, even clothes. One nobleman was reportedly seen wearing a murdered man's ring at dinner. It wasn't just hatred, it was profit. And in some places, it became a game. Who could act first? Who could purge their town the fastest? Leaders built reputations on the backs of blood and ashes. One mayor boasted in writing that his city was free of the infection and cleansed of its source, meaning Jews, not the plague. You read that line twice. It still doesn't make sense. But to him, it did. There's a town a few days' ride away where the local officials tried something unusual. They refused to act on the accusations, refused to torture, to confiscate, to kill. And guess what? The plague hit them exactly the same. No worse, no better. Just randomly, like a disease. But they never apologized for standing against the lie. They didn't have to. And maybe that's the quietest rebellion of all. A fringe tale floats around now about a Jewish doctor who treated plague victims in secret, saving dozens before he was found out and killed. Some say it's true, others say it's myth. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that even in the middle of chaos and cruelty, someone chose compassion. And you wonder, if one person can do that, how many more could have, but didn't? You walk through a field where a village once stood. Nothing remains but stones and weeds. The well sits at the center, untouched now. People are afraid of it, still. Not because of poison, but because of what happened after the rumor. You peer down into the dark, where the lie was said to begin. You don't see poison, just your own reflection. The wind has changed. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but in the subtle way that late afternoon light begins to stretch longer across the stone. The plague has weakened. People emerge cautiously from behind shuttered doors, blinking at a world reshaped by death. No town is untouched. The roads are quieter, the market stalls emptier, the song slower. But the lie, it's still here. You feel it in the way people glance sideways, in the way they talk around the past, not through it. The streets have been swept, the blood washed away. But everyone remembers. They just pretend they don't. The silence now is almost worse than the screaming. In towns like Nuremberg, Trier, and Worms, the Jewish quarters have been abandoned, overgrown. Some have been converted into grain storage or left to rot. In others, churches have been built over synagogues, literally burying what once was. It's an act of architectural amnesia. You walk past one such building, and your fingers brush the stone. There's Hebrew carved faintly beneath newer plaster. Someone tried to erase it, but you see it still. You ask someone about the old families who used to live there, the baker with the wide laugh, the scholar with too many books, the child who always wore red shoes. The local man shrugs. They left, he says. They didn't leave. They were left burning. Let's be honest, most people don't want to talk about what happened. It's easier to pretend the lie was necessary, that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to it, that the confessions weren't entirely false, that justice was served, that they didn't just slaughter their neighbors out of fear and ignorance. And yet, a few voices rise, quiet at first. Clerics who reread the Pope's warnings and wonder why they weren't obeyed. Chroniclers who write, not just of plague and panic, but of guilt. One even uses the word massacre, not a word you see often in official records of the time. But don't mistake that for widespread reflection. For the most part, Europe simply moves on. The lie is folded into history, sewn up neatly alongside divine punishment and celestial portents. When the next wave of plague arrives decades later, people point fingers again. The targets shift. The method remains. You, though, you remember, because you were there, not on the front line with a torch maybe, but in the crowd, listening, wondering, silently doubting, but not speaking. And that stays with you longer than the fever. Here's a strange little relic. In the margins of a 14th century psalter, someone doodled a drawing, a man with a rat's tail being chased by fleas. It's oddly playful, like the artist almost understood the truth. But beside the image, in faded ink, is a single word: blasphemer. Even art couldn't escape the lie. Some Jewish survivors find refuge in distant lands: Poland, Lithuania, the Ottoman Empire. They rebuild slowly. Communities bloom again, albeit far from where their ancestors once thrived. King Casimir in Poland becomes known for his protection of Jewish people, and under his rule, towns like Krakow and Lviv become safe havens, for a while. But there's always a whisper, because the lie doesn't die. It adapts. Over the centuries, it takes new forms. Well poisoning becomes ritual murder, which becomes global conspiracies. Same melody, new lyrics. Historians track these evolutions like a virus mutating, and some trace it back to this very moment, this first massive deployment of a fabricated enemy, justified by desperation. In a way, the Middle Ages didn't just birth the myth, it perfected it. And you're left sitting in a town square where none of the victims have gravestones, their names unspoken, their stories left to be imagined or forgotten. You remember the well. You remember the fire. You remember the silence after. There's a school nearby, now built over what was once a Jewish cemetery. The children laugh as they run through the courtyard. They don't know, not yet. You wonder if they ever will, or if the lie will simply rest here, curled up beneath their feet. A historian you met once said something you can't shake. The worst lies are the ones told when the truth is too painful to bear. You wonder how much of this century has been shaped by that pain. And then, you notice something else. A young girl drawing in chalk on the edge of a building. She's sketching stars, 6-pointed ones. She doesn't look up as you pass, she just draws. Bright yellow stars across gray stone. Maybe she knows. Maybe it's starting again. Or maybe, just maybe, it's healing. You exhale finally. The lie has done its worst, but history remembers. And so do you. Now, close your eyes for a moment. You're no longer standing in the fire-lit squares of 14th century Europe. The wind no longer carries the acrid bite of smoke or the hush of an unspeakable secret. The bells have fallen silent. The torches have gone cold. And you've made it through the worst of it. The plague may have passed, but its echo lingers, not in the bodies it claimed, but in the choices people made. Lies, after all, don't vanish when the danger ends. They sink in, they fester. But even then, remembering them is the first step to breaking their power. History doesn't ask us to change the past. It just asks us not to repeat it. So, rest now, knowing that even in the darkest chapters, there are those who stood against the current, those who whispered truth when screams demanded otherwise, And even if their names are lost to time, their courage hums quietly beneath the surface of every story we retell. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift, untethered from the fires and fears. You've seen what happens when fear wins, when reason breaks, when silence becomes complicity. But you've also seen the flicker of something better. And maybe, just maybe, you'll carry that with you, into your dreams, into tomorrow, into a kinder history. End of script, sweet dreams.